The student will describe the impact of events that led to the ratification of the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Okay, so this is the standard that we're focusing on, SS8H4. You have to understand, I'm expecting you to understand, not just describe the impact of the events, but to understand how these events led to other events looming in the future of the United States. In regards to the Articles of Confederation, you need to analyze the strengths and weaknesses of both the Georgia Constitution of 1777 and the Articles of Confederation, and explain how weaknesses in the Articles of Confederation led to a need to revise these articles. Okay, so both the Constitution, Georgia Constitution of 1777, and the Articles of Confederation were very similar in their in the way they laid out the governments. So the strengths of the Georgia Constitution. The Georgia Constitution, the first constitution that our state had, was written to emulate or reflect the Constitution that the federal government had proposed, which was the Articles of Confederation. And you have to understand, the people of the colonies and now these new states viewed themselves as independent, and they wanted power to be in the hands of the people. So they recognized popular sovereignty, which is that the government's powers and the will of the people, that it's the people who give the government the authority to rule. And then they also believed in the separation of powers. Remember, the king was way too strong, and so they believed in spreading out the power amongst all the offices of the government. Now, we have those two philosophies are still embedded in our government today. But there were a lot of weaknesses in the Constitution and the Articles of Confederation. In the Constitution of 1777 and the Articles of Confederation, there were a lot of weaknesses. For the Georgia State Constitution of 1777, one of the flaws was all of the power was in the legislative branch. They appointed the governor, so they appointed the head of the executive branch, and they only had one house. It was a unicameral, uni meaning one, unicameral legislature, known as the House of Assembly. And the House of Assembly could make the laws, they could appoint officials, they appointed judges, so they were extremely powerful. And this is going to set them up for some problems along the way. Now, the strengths of the Articles of Confederation were that, one, it created a union. It was the United States of America. There was a representative government. All states had a vote. But like the Constitution of 1777, there was one house. It was a unicameral legislation. And you will see how this is going to create a lot of problems down the road. The union was very weak. Congress could not impose taxes. So Congress could declare war, but they had no way of paying for the war because they could not impose taxes or levy taxes on all of the states. They could not regulate trade between the states. So this meant that states could impose tariffs on each other. There was no president, no court system. All of the power was in the hands of our Congress under the Articles of Confederation. We see how effective that would be today, since our Congress doesn't want to do anything. That's a judgment call. And as years go by, hopefully that statement will be seen as being out of date. Why would the authors of the Articles and the Georgia Constitution be inclined to create a weak executive branch? They were terrified of creating an environment that would have replicated something like under the king. Remember, they had come from a tyranny, a tyrant, and they did not want to suffer those indignities again. Now, the Constitutional Convention. So both of these documents were in place for about 10 years, okay? And they just were really not successful. Our country did not get off with on the right foot. They made some mistakes, much like a toddler who is learning to walk is going to fall and get up and fall and get up, and it takes time. Well, a new country is similar to that. They had to learn from their mistakes, and they did. So almost 10 years after writing the Articles of Confederation, they came back together under a constitutional convention of 1787. And you need to understand the role of Georgia at the Constitutional Convention. You also need to understand the role of Abraham Baldwin and William Few, who were the signers of the Constitution, and understand why we ratified the Constitution. Now, while Georgia played a very small role in the Revolution, you could argue that our role in the drafting of the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, not the Articles of Confederation, but the U.S. Constitution, was significant. So our U.S. economy was shaky. We had heavy debt after the war. States were taxing one another. They were arguing over boundaries. It was just like a lot of squabbling around between each other. They needed a stronger central government. And our founding fathers and leaders realized that the Articles of Confederation needed to be revised. This was their intention, to revise the Articles of Confederation. They had no intention of writing a new constitution. Georgia sent 4 delegates: William Pierce, William Houston, William Few, and Abraham Baldwin. Their interests were to oppose a ban on slavery. At this point, by this time, slavery had a deep hold on Georgia. They wanted to create a strong central government, and they wanted protection from the Creek Indians. Now, the Constitutional Convention lasted for about 4 months. Again, they're meeting in Philadelphia in the middle of the summer. Stifling heat, much like writing the Declaration of Independence, in complete secrecy. Now, it all comes to a head on July 2nd in 1787. And everyone has it's like today, they're entrenched in their sides. They are determined to, the smaller states wanted representation based on population. The larger states wanted equal representation. Everyone is threatening to leave. The roll was called. Georgia voted last. When its turn came, the issue was tied, and Georgia's delegation came down to Abraham Baldwin and Houston, and they could potentially break the tide. Now, Houston voted with the large states. Remember, Georgia was a large state, small population, large state. They wanted equal representation. Surprisingly, Baldwin voted with the small states, which would have given power to, power was based on population at that point. Now remember, Georgia did not have a large population. By splitting Georgia's vote, it remained a tie. And so the convention had to turn the matter over to a committee. Okay, so because of Georgia, it goes into committee. And it's in this committee that the Great Compromise is devised, which creates a bicameral legislation. The Senate, which has, each state has 2 votes, and then the House of Representatives, which is based on population. Delegates, of course, agreed on this compromise, and it really is, if you think about it, a brilliant compromise. For Georgia, interestingly enough, as the centuries have passed, our delegation to the House of Representatives has grown and grown, and today we are actually a considerably large state in terms of the population. So Houston and Baldwin had split the vote. Baldwin voted with the small states. The other compromise that came out of the committee and out of this constitutional convention was the 3/5 compromise. So Georgia, unsurprisingly, argued that slaves should be counted, of course, as part of the population. However, they would not be able to vote. So they were not citizens because, of course, they were viewed as property. The 3/5 compromise determined that only 3 of every 5 slaves were counted for taxation and representation. You also had the Commerce Compromise, that Congress would regulate all trade and would impose tariffs for the whole country. And then Congress would not regulate the slave trade for 20 years, the Slave Trade Compromise. Okay, so you should be able to evaluate the strengths and the weaknesses of the two, of the Constitution of 1777 and the Articles of Confederation. You should be able to compare those. They are very similar. And then compare both of those with the okay, let's talk about your role as a citizen under Georgia's Constitution. You need to be able to explain the basic structure of the state constitution. Okay, so Georgia's Constitution of 1777, much like the Articles of Confederation, they realized it wasn't working, so they went back to the drawing board. Today, it also resembles, is very similar to the U.S. Constitution. However, our Constitution outlines qualifications for voting and running for public office. Our Constitution has 10 articles. There have been several revisions. We've had a number of constitutions. It also begins with a preamble giving the reasons. There is a Bill of Rights, much like the Constitution of the United States. And of course, the Article 1 deals with the Bill of Rights, Article 2, voting in elections, Article 3, the legislative branch, Article 4, constitutional boards and conventions, Article 5, executive branch, 6, judicial, 7, taxation and finance, 8, education, 9, counties and municipal courts, 10, amendments to the Constitution, 11, miscellaneous provisions. Those miscellaneous provisions talks about how Georgia's constitutions have changed over the years. Now, you need to understand the separation of powers and the checks and balances between each branch. Separation of powers, this is for federal and for state. The government power is divided between the branches. Each branch has different distinct jobs. The legislative branch makes the laws, executive branch carries them out, judicial branch reviews them. Checks and balances, the ability of one branch to check the power of another branch. Okay, so there are different ways that this happens. Let's talk about that. The judicial branch is the one who reviews the laws that are carried out by the executive branch. So the executive branch has to follow the laws as they were written by the legislative branch. Okay, remember, the executive branch appoints judges, but they are confirmed by the Senate. Now, that's on the federal level. Most of our judges here in Georgia are not appointed. Only in special circumstances are they appointed. They are elected officials in Georgia. Okay, the rights and responsibilities of citizens. Your rights are standards, they are the standards that keep institutions from harming people's freedoms. You have the right to life, liberty, and property, freedom of speech, right to keep and bear arms, the right to trial, no banishment or whipping for a crime, no imprisonment for debt. Remember, think about why Georgia was founded. And you have the right to fish and the right to hunt. You have the responsibility of paying taxes, obeying laws, and knowing the consequences. This is where, ignorance is no defense, right? You have the right to vote, and you have the responsibility to vote. That is a responsibility, not a right. You are expected to vote. Sadly, only about a third of our population votes, and you are expected to serve on juries. Okay, the voting and qualifications. To vote in Georgia, you must be registered. You must be a U.S. citizen. You must be a legal Georgia resident and in the county you wish to vote in. You have to be at least 17 and a half years of age to vote, to register, and 18 when you vote. You cannot be serving a sentence for a crime of moral turpitude. In other words, those are some really severe crimes. And you cannot be determined by the courts to be mentally incompetent. Okay, political parties. We have two major political parties. There are others. There are minor ones, Libertarian, Green Party, but the two major ones, Democrats and Republicans. You do not have to join a party, but candidates choose one or the other. They represent different ideas and interests, and the candidate's job is to make those ideas into government policy. Traditionally, Republicans tend to be conservative, believing in smaller government, and Democrats believe traditionally to be more liberal, believing that they're in stronger government and greater reach of government. Okay, so understand your rights, understand the role of the citizen, and that's it for today.